Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Congressman Gephardt. As is our tradition here at the Detroit Economic Club, we have usually a period of time, noting that 1:30 is our quitting time, to ask questions and receive responses from you. Within the given time that we have got, let me first ask your comments on a great many questions. Let me just thank all of you that submitted these. They're excellent questions that in large measure touch on China, touch on most favored nation status. And let me read this question. China is a huge and growing market for United States products, especially for Michigan products. Your views do not seem to take into account that other countries will gladly trade with China if we don't. Can you please explain?
Well, let me say to you that I have a lot of companies in my district who do a lot of business in China as well. McDonnell Douglas, Monsanto, Anheuser-Busch, to name a few. Emerson, we have many great companies there as well. And my answer is what I tried to say in the speech, and that is if we let money get in between us and our goal of human rights for all, then we're in big trouble. This nation has always been driven and focused on the paramount goal of natural human rights for all human beings in the world. And I believe that we can achieve that goal over time if we will meet our rhetoric with our actions. And I use the analogy of South Africa. When we were going through the debate over South African sanctions and taking away their trading rights, we met the very same arguments. The business community said, we'll never get change in South Africa. The business community said that the Europeans and others would go there and get lucrative contracts, and they did. But America stayed the course, and we led, and we got others to follow. And we finally got the entire world to follow our leadership. And it wasn't too many months after that decision was made that we were able to get freedom, and Nelson Mandela left his jail cell and ultimately became, incredibly, the president of the country. Now, the only difference between South Africa and China is China's bigger. And I understand the argument that this is a market that we can't easily give up. But it's also a market that we can't allow to continue to be run in the way it's being run. It is wrong. It is deeply wrong, as I tried to say. And when you talk to these dissidents who have come back looking to America for leadership, and you are asked where we are, I don't think today we have a good answer. And I think we've got to find our voice on this issue. And I think if we will, and making the decision is the hardest thing to do, it always is, then we can get the rest of the world to make the decision with us, and then we will get progress on human rights and worker rights in China, which we must have to have a decent world trading system, to have a decent world economy, and to have a decent world.
Congressman, picking right up on one of the points that you just mentioned, the human rights question, given the combination of most favored nations and the curing of what are horrible conditions for lots of people, as you have described, let me read this next question. Given that there are distinct problems in China, what alternatives are you proposing to bring about democratic principles to one of the oldest and largest nations in the world?
Well, first, as I said, I think we've got to proceed with an active policy on both a multilateral and a bilateral front. By that I mean we need to work in international organizations, the United Nations, the G7, other regional, APEC, other groups around the world to bring pressure on China for change. In addition, in our bilateral relationship with China, we need to make it clear that we expect, if we're going to have a normal trading relationship, to have clear progress toward human rights and worker rights and environmental protection in China. In every other year, we've granted most favored nation status, which simply means we'll treat China the way we treat every other favored country that we are dealing with. So our tariffs are as low for China as they are for any other country. My argument is that China is different than most other countries. And let me explain more forcefully, and again, why I think this human rights issue is so inextricably intertwined with the trade issue. If we allow trade with a country that has no human or worker rights, you can expect that their standard of living is never going to go up. That puts huge pressure downward on the wages of American workers, because that becomes the competition. I visited plants in China where workers were working for $1.50 a day, not an hour, a day. Some workers there get nothing. They're slave labor, they're prison labor. That's very hard to compete with. Try as we might, as good as we are, as hard as our workers work, as good as our corporations are being led today, it is very hard to compete against that. But worse than that, I could put up with that if I thought that over time we were going to get progress. I don't have that confidence today with China, but if I did, then I could say, well, let's go ahead because we've got to have trade. But in addition to that, if their standard of living never goes up, there's never going to be anybody there to buy anything. And trade is a two-way street. You got to be a buyer and a seller. Now, we figured out the demand side, I mean the supply side of the world economy. What we can't figure out is the demand side. I sometimes get the feeling we're going to have 7 billion people out there making products for 500 million Americans, Europeans, and Japanese. I mean, Henry Ford, probably in this city, said it right many years ago, I got to pay the workers enough so there's somebody to buy the cars. That's our problem today. The Chinese consumer can't buy products made in China or the United States or anywhere else. So it makes economic sense, deep economic sense, to have a world trading system which I believe would be synergistic, would be win-win-win-win-win, where everybody's standard of living goes up and competition improves everybody's economic performance. But if the markets are shut or if they don't have human rights, they're never going to be compatible with a world trading system that works for everybody. So this human rights and worker issue lies at the heart of having a sound world trading system and economic system.
Thank you, Congressman. There were several questions regarding the current negotiations vis-a-vis the global climate issue. Would you like to comment, please?
Well, I think it is important to engage in these negotiations. All of us have deep environmental concerns. My only thought here, though, is that as we enter these negotiations, we again have to get everybody on a level playing field. If we're going to say that countries like China are developing and therefore they don't have to be part of the worldwide rules to protect us against the greenhouse effect, then we're in real trouble. Again, we have a huge disadvantage in being in a global trading system if we have to follow tight rules, which we've been willing to talk about, and China or Mexico or Brazil or Argentina or other large countries go scot-free and don't have to do anything because they're developing and somehow we're developed. All I'm saying is let's negotiate, but let's have a standard set of rules that everybody can deal with.
I ask you to change gears a bit. You are in the middle of a very large labor community in Detroit. We have been engaged in a strike for now some 23 months with the Detroit newspapers. The principal issue is one that I think is also a national issue, and that is the issue of permanent replacements, whether they should be continued, whether they should be allowed, whether they should be barred. Can you give us any indication of what in the upcoming session of Congress how you will deal with that question?
Well, I have been for some long time for changing the law or making clear what we thought the law was on prohibiting permanent replacement workers. And I feel that strongly. I feel that strongly because I see labor unions, and I'm not saying a worker has to join a union or not, that's their choice. But I do believe that unions have been the major force in our country to protect the rights of workers, to get workers to be properly paid for their hard work and productivity, and for getting us a strong and growing middle class with consumers who again can buy the products that we are making. I'm a Democrat. I make no apology for it. I'm a proud Democrat, and I believe in building economic strength from the bottom up. And I think that is the great strength of unions and the Democratic Party.
Next, Congressman, and we have been given permission to run over a bit from our president, and we're very pleased to be able to do that, to hear some more of your views. We'd like to ask you to turn your attention to the economic area. And let me read the question. It has been said that the average American has worked from January 1st through the end of this week just to pay their tax burden. Is there any tax relief in sight?
Well, there is. I hope it goes to the people who need it. I've been critical of the budget because I'm worried that the tax relief will be inordinately directed at folks at the top. I think everybody wants tax relief. I am certainly for tax relief and a tax cut. But I think we've got to keep in our mind one very important fact. In the last 15 years, the top 1% of wage earners have seen their compensation and their pay go up by about 90%. People in the middle have seen their pay stay the same or fall even behind in that same period of time. When I go out in my district in St. Louis and go door to door, as I will do tomorrow, I meet middle-income citizens who are working feverishly to overcome their economic problems. I met a young couple recently and said between them they have 5 jobs in order to support their young family. The wife said that she would like to quit her job so she could stay home with the kids. She said, I can't, because if we don't get the income from my 2 jobs, we can't make the car and house payment. We lived in a very modest home. And the great problem that comes from this is not just a monetary problem. Our problem is that adults are spending so much less time with children raising children today. Listen to these facts. 1/3 less time by adults with children than 20 years ago. 1/3 less time. The average American worker works 200 hours more a year now than they worked 20 years ago. And what's happening? A child care deficit. It's one of the reasons we're talking in the budget about trying to help revolutionize our public schools so that children are cared for and supervised so that they can become productive citizens. So, yes to tax relief, but let's get it to the people who need it. We're trying to balance the budget. That's the first goal. Once we got that done, then let's focus the tax relief that we produce at the people who desperately need it, so the size of the tax cut for them can help get the job done.
Thank you, Congressman. The last question, and once again we're going to change gears a bit on you. Considering that our Latin American neighbors, specifically Chile, have been waiting for the United States to take action on our promises of negotiated free trade, do you intend to support fast-track legislation in September?
I am for free trade treaties with countries in Central and South America and elsewhere for that matter. That's not the issue. The issue is, what do those treaties contain? And here, like I've been arguing today on human rights in China, I believe a free trade treaty, which again I remind you is a marriage. We're not talking MFN here, we're talking zero tariffs. We're talking marriage. Right now today, when you're in Mexico, economically you're in the United States. There's no tariff, ultimately no tariff on any good going back and forth. All I want is a clause in those treaties that says that all the parties to the treaties will faithfully enforce their labor, worker, and environmental laws. Now, Chile is ready to do this. I would support fast track for Chile tomorrow. In fact, I put in legislation saying, let's do Chile alone, because their labor movement is strong, their laws are well enforced, and as are their environmental laws. My concern is, having gone through NAFTA without strong labor and environment clauses in the treaties, with trade sanctions to enforce them, we are not getting the proper enforcement, in my view, of Mexico's labor and environmental laws. I recently went to the border. I hadn't been there in 3.5 years. I visited the so-called maquiladora, our twin plants along the border. In 3.5 years, there has been almost a doubling of the number of plants, a doubling of the number of employees, which in a sense is good. It's one of the few places in Mexico jobs are being created, and that is good. But the wages have gone from $1 an hour to 70 cents an hour, and the turnover rate in the maquiladora plants is about 100%, which means people are coming to the border, taking a job, finding you can't live even there on 70 cents an hour. They're either going back home or they're crossing the border. Now, in NAFTA, we have specific provisions in the treaty that specifically protect intellectual property and capital property of United States companies. We would not think of signing a free trade treaty that did not protect capital and intellectual property, and we should. But when it comes to labor rights on both sides of the border, when it comes to environmental protections, which we all desire, we don't want to put that in the treaty. That isn't important enough to put in the treaty. Now we got to take another look. We got to think this through again. We can have free trade. We need free trade. We're in a little bitty world today. Anybody who argues protectionism is not in touch with reality. With today's transportation and communications, we have to trade with the world. And it's good for us to trade. We sit in a city that has a much more competitive automobile industry today because of free trade. Don't tell me our American companies and workers can't compete. We can compete with anybody in the world. We have the best workers on the face of the earth, the most independent, the most self-reliant, the most flexible, the most willing to take change of any set of workers in the world. But we cannot succeed if we are on an unlevel playing field. And we are on an unlevel playing field with countries like Mexico, our countries in Central and South America who want free trade treaties, if we say it doesn't matter if you enforce your economic and labor laws. It does matter. It matters just as much as if they enforce their intellectual property and capital laws. That's what I'm asking for. If we can get those clauses in the treaties, I'll support free trade across the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Congressman Richard A. Gephardt. Well, I would like to turn this meeting back over to the President, Bill Halling.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Richard Gephardt, for addressing the Economic Club of Detroit today. You honor us with your presence. Thank you, Ed Scribner, for presiding over this meeting. Thanks to all of you for coming. This meeting is adjourned. Hey, well done, Ed. Oh, nice job.
Thank you. Our privilege. Always a delight to be with you. Our pleasure this time. Congratulations, by the way. Thank you.
That was a terrific story. Oh, get out of here. How you doing? Good to see you. It's, September 21st.
Well done.
Last week, President Clinton sent a request to Congress to extend China's most favored nation trading status for another year. Lawmakers likely will debate the request next month. The status simply means that the United States offers China its best possible tariffs and trade preferences. Right now, Congressman Gephardt and his colleagues are in recess for Memorial Day. When members return, they'll complete work on the budget resolution and also on $8.5 billion in emergency spending, primarily for disaster relief. See the House when members return next week here on C-SPAN.
Finally tonight, essayist Roger Rosenblatt has some thoughts about the value of one life.
The story of Chinese dissident Wei Jingsheng is a lesson in sublime pig-headedness. In December 1978, Wei created a wall poster in China that demanded, of all ridiculous things, democracy of China's leaders. Deng Xiaoping, who used the word democracy to win power over his rivals after Mao, had, of course, no interest in the idea of democracy once in power. He ordered the arrest of Wei Jingsheng and sentenced him to 15 years. In prison, Wei's health decayed, but pighead that he is, he continued to write about freedom, and he became, to Deng's irritation, a cause célèbre. He was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. The government decided to release him on September 14, 1993, and Wei, actually believing that he was free and acting according to his nature, again published his democratic essays. The government, responding according to its nature, clapped him in jail again, and there he sits today, still writing away as if he is allowed to. The book of his writings just published is called The Courage to Stand Alone. The book is the product of one voice in a prison cell very far away, and it calls out to the world of freer thought, specifically to us. Explicitly, it argues that human rights is the essential standard of government. Implicitly, it argues that capitalism and dictatorship isn't the same thing as capitalism and democracy. The latter strives to complement a free market with a free people. The former uses a free market to reinforce a repressive regime. So here we have it again. Late in the 20th century, with Russian communism given the bum's rush at last, and democracy looking like a better idea all the time to the nations of the world, in the world's largest nation, one small, stubborn voice still speaks the obvious. Wei Jingsheng stands alone in a distinguished line of political prisoners, and unless China begins to believe its own rhetoric, he is likely to stew in prison forever. To the cruel absurdity of his state, he adds the absurdity of thinking that words can alter circumstances, evidently having concluded that it is better to express democratic ideals from behind bars than to capitulate to a false freedom. Emerson once asked Thoreau, who was jailed for his beliefs, "Why are you in here?" Thoreau replied, "Why are you out there?" The implication, we've heard it for hundreds of years, is that the person locked up for seeking freedom is freer than the ones outside who do not. The philosopher Boethius knew this, as did Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr. and Nelson Mandela and Andrei Sakharov, and on and on. Pigheads, every one. If Wei kept his mouth shut, he would be breathing fresh air today. Those who do not care about the integrity of one lone man want him to do exactly that. It makes it easier to get on with business, the inconvenience of human rights removed. Oddly, Wei writes of the courage to stand alone, but he doesn't think that standing alone is all that wonderful. To the contrary. In one of his letters, he writes that the person who claims not to need society, in fact, relies on it for his very existence. Thus, he calls out to others whom he needs. The question he poses is, do we need him? And that is not for Wei to answer. He waits in prison and is like the philosophical riddle one used to ponder in high school. If you could profit from the death of a single person in China, would you will that death? China was so far away, after all, and it was merely one life. I'm Roger Rosenblatt.
Again, the major stories of this Wednesday: tornadoes swept through central Texas overnight, killing at least 29 people. 28 are still missing. The defense rested at the Oklahoma City bombing trial in Denver. Closing arguments begin tomorrow. And the Federal Trade Commission voted to restrict the Joe Camel cigarette advertising campaign because it targets children. R.J. Reynolds said it would fight that charge. We'll see you online and again here tomorrow evening. I'm Jim Lara. Thank you and good night.
Major funding for the NewsHour with Jim Lehrer has been provided by the Archer Daniels Midland Company, ADM, supermarket to the world. And by New York Life, yet another example of New York Life's wise investment philosophy. And by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and by the annual financial support from viewers like you.
Now, going home Hong Kong style. Many residents of the British colony were originally from the neighboring province of Guangdong. The island reversed to Chinese control on July 1st, but some have already made the return trip. Ian Williams of Independent Television News reports.
The border between China and Hong Kong, where farmland meets a bustling metropolis. Only the farms are on the Hong Kong side. And the modern skyline is the new Chinese city of Shenzhen. It's the gateway to Guangdong province, China's richest, where an economic revolution has taken place thanks largely to Hong Kong entrepreneurs. Men like textile tycoon Xu Wo-Yam. Like hundreds of thousands of other Hong Kong Chinese, he was born in southern China, but fled from the communists. He made himself rich in the British colony, but when China opened its door to outside investment in the late 70s, he was one of the first to walk back through it, building a factory in Dongguan, the very town in which he was born, and the home of 700,000 other Hong Kong people. Sentiment aside, cheap and plentiful labor made his hometown a much more profitable place for manufacturing than increasingly costly Hong Kong, where he maintains his home and headquarters. But like other Hong Kong businessmen, Mr. Yam has ploughed some profit into social services. He and two others built a local school. A health clinic is funded by Mr. Yam, and later this year it will be joined by a new hospital, also paid for by the textile tycoon. Then you were living just around here. Mr. Yam's ancestral village is still largely as he left it in 1958. As a boy, he learned how to sew in his father's textile workshop, which was closed down by the communists in 1955. His father was forced to work on the land, and the poverty of his family and village encouraged him to leave his home. And this was your house?
Yes, this is my house. I born in here.
Starvation is rampant in China.
His departure was soon followed by a mass exodus. Thousands of people, including half Mr. Yam's village, fled into Hong Kong to escape the hardship and famine caused by Mao's disastrous Great Leap Forward. And those desperate refugees provided the labor and skills for the industrialization of the British colony, building a manufacturing powerhouse, producing everything from textiles to electronics and children's toys. Among them, Mr. Yam. He started as a janitor in a clothes shop, but by the late 60s was a rich man owning his own factory. And the wealth of Hong Kong businessmen like Mr. Yam has produced a similarly rapid economic miracle across the border in southern China.
At the height of Hong Kong's manufacturing industries in 1981, we had 900,000 manufacturing workers in Hong Kong. In 1995, the number of manufacturing, in 1996, the number of manufacturing workers in Hong Kong has shrunk from the 900,000 peak to about 300,000 odd. But we employ about 3.5 million workers in Guangdong province alone.
Hong Kong entrepreneurs have transformed the economy of southern China. They've been the driving force behind a development frenzy that's changed beyond recognition the towns and villages from which they fled. And now, it's not only in the field of economics that Hong Kong influence is being felt.
广东卫星广播。
广东卫星广播。Talkback Radio, Hong Kong style, is the most popular program in the provincial capital of Guangzhou, and the first of its type in China. Every evening, hundreds of listeners call in to comment on the day's hot issue, which ranges from crime to consumer affairs. Guangzhou has also been a pioneer in the field of consumer rights in China. A Consumer Affairs Council, modelled on Hong Kong, has dealt with more than 50,000 complaints about shoddy or fake goods since new laws were introduced 3 years ago. In China, challenging authority can be a risky exercise, but if the council's caseload is anything to go by, the people of Guangzhou appear increasingly willing to exercise their rights, at least as consumers. Hong Kong television is widely received and watched in Guangdong province, which shares the same Cantonese language as Hong Kong and has the highest number of televisions per head in China. But it also shows the sensitivities of the authorities towards some aspects of Hong Kong influence. News items about China are frequently blocked. In Mr. Yam's ancestral village, the houses long deserted by those who fled to Hong Kong have been taken over by migrant workers. While Mr. Yam found his fortune in Hong Kong, they're among millions seeking theirs in a Guangdong built with Hong Kong money. The handover is certainly not a reunion of two strangers. Hong Kong's contribution to the modernization of China has been enormous and will continue to grow.
And refusal to renounce the threat of force against Taiwan tell why China is, in fact, and should remain in our diplomacy different from most other countries. Market-based capitalism may have come to China, but Beijing's rulers still too often seem not to trust the agents of capitalism, the people themselves, to determine their own futures. We want to see China change. That is what the debate is really about here in Congress. And here again, the President's recommendation to extend MFN for another year is the right one. China's economy is its main engine of political reform. Economic stability and growth, which renewing MFN will promote, helps fuel China's transformation toward a democratically oriented free market society. Anybody who has been to China in recent years can see this, can feel it. That is clearly in our own best interest, and it reflects our fundamental values as a nation. We seek to expand freedom and the rule of law. A stable trade relationship with China helps to do just that. It brings to individuals within China a better standard of living, increased freedom of choice, better working conditions, broadening respect for the rule of law in business transactions and elsewhere, and the expectation that individual effort and initiative matter. In other words, trade with American businesses that reflect American values brings with it respect for individual rights and dignity. Everyone understands, frankly those who oppose MFN, I think, as well as those of us who support it, that China will not be transformed overnight. But if we interrupt trade with China, it will be many more long nights before that great and large country becomes what we would like it to be. So we will support MFN renewal for China, which is the immediate issue at hand, but I think it's also time to move beyond this annual MFN debate to a more comprehensive China policy, one that does not constantly seem to pit our values against our economic interests and activities. That, in fact, is the wrong equation. It's a false equation. Our economic interests advance and coincide with our political and moral values in this case. A good first step would be to normalize our economic relationship by bringing China into the World Trade Organization and thereby opening its markets more fully to American services and products. It also means bringing our anger about China's human rights and proliferation policies to the center of our bilateral relationship and being willing to invoke sanctions against the Chinese when necessary, as we did last week in the case of the companies trading in chemicals with Iran. But it does not mean and should not mean denying MFN, which in my opinion amounts to shooting not just the Chinese but ourselves in the foot, economically and politically. Perhaps within our lifetimes, and certainly in the lifetimes of our children, China will be the premier Asian power. Whether that is a threat or promise depends in large part on how we manage our relations with China today. Building a stable, normal, honest, and demanding trade relationship with China, which includes the extension of MFN, is a very important, I'd say a vital step in that desired direction. I'm very honored to be joined here today by a good personal friend and a friend of the DLC's, Congressman Bob Matsui, who in addition to all of that happens to be the ranking Democrat on the Trade Subcommittee of the House Ways and Means Committee. And it's my honor to call on Bob now.
Thank you very much, Joe. And I'd like to thank you, Senator Lieberman, certainly to Al Fromm, the president of the DLC, and Bob Manning with the Progressive Policy Institute. Let me say this. I think that the United States-China relationship is probably the most important bilateral relationship the United States will have over the next 25 years. Now that we've seen the fall of the Berlin Wall and the demise of the Soviet Union, it's very, very important for us not to have another Cold War. And it's my opinion that if we cut off most favored nation status with the Chinese, it would be equivalent to cutting off diplomatic relationships with the Chinese at this particular point in time. And that means issues like the accession of Hong Kong into China, the issue of Taiwan, the issue of Tibet, the issue of human rights, the issue of market access, intellectual properties, all these will not be issues that we can discuss and negotiate with the Chinese. The elimination of most favored nation status, which is basically normalized trade relations with the Chinese, will give you nothing. In fact, we would be isolating the United States from a wide and vast market. This is not like South Africa. This is not like Cuba, where one can isolate another nation. This is a nation with 21% of the world population, 1.2 billion people. If we withdraw from China, the Japanese, the Europeans, the Brazilians, and other nations will be very, very pleased in the long run by that activity. Lloyd Bentsen, when he was Secretary of Treasury, made an interesting observation in Los Angeles in 1994. He said the Chinese will be spending about $1 trillion worth of infrastructure over the next 10 years. That's equivalent to building 18 Santa Monica freeways every day for the next 10 years. Right now in China, there are 2 homes wired for telephones for every 100 homes in China. They, in the next 6 years, want to double that to 4 homes for every 100 homes in China. That would be equivalent to building one entire Pacific Telesis network with telephones, wires, and everything else per year for the next 6 years. If we're not in that market, we're going to lose our technological edge, because there's no question in my mind that the Europeans, the Japanese, and other nations will get in there. They will be able to experiment with these technological skills, and we will fall behind. But most importantly, if in fact we could change China's behavior, if in fact we can actually advance the cause of human rights by eliminating most favored nation status, I would agree with that. But the fact of the matter is it will do no good at all. It will merely put China on a course that could result in a Cold War over the next decade and a half. Let me mention one area that I believe you will hear more and more about over the next few months, and that's the fact that we have a $40 billion trade deficit with China. As you recall, in the past, many of the opponents were talking about the fact that human rights was very important, and they realized that the issue of human rights would possibly be advanced by continuing most favored nation status. Now you're going to hear more and more about the trade deficit, the $40 billion trade deficit with China. To put it in perspective, the 4 tigers, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Korea, South Korea that is, and Taiwan, Hong Kong, South Korea, and what was the other one? Singapore, excuse me, Singapore. In 1986 had a $34 billion trade surplus. We had a $34 billion trade deficit with these 4 countries. Today, it's down to $10 billion, whereas China's is $40 billion, their trade surplus with the United States. What's happened is not job losses in the U.S. because of this trade deficit with the Chinese. What it is that the other countries, the four tigers, are losing jobs because of China's ascendancy. We know all how these things work. In the 50s, the Japanese were exporting textiles. In the 60s and 70s and early 80s, it was the Philippines plus these four countries, China. And now it is China, in addition to these other countries. And so the trade deficit issue is a specious issue. That one, in fact, should not work because the trade deficit issue really is a result of the reduced trade deficit in the other four countries. Let me conclude by making one further observation that Senator Lieberman referred to. Our relations with the Chinese will evolve over a period of years. One thing that we have to be aware of is that we cannot be impatient with respect to the Chinese. This is a relationship that will have to develop over a number of years. We will not see all the dissidents released within a 12-month period. We knew that in the early 1990s. We knew that China would not move over to a democratic form of government within 24 months. It's going to take time, and it's going to take patience on behalf of all of us. But I will say that as you engage the Chinese commercially, and as they begin to work and recognize certain rules of behavior in commercial activities, as they begin to recognize due process in commercial activities, you will begin to see a court system arise in China. And it's my opinion that over time you will see a further liberalization of China's repressive system of government. In addition, and which is also extremely important, is the fact that when you have a marketplace economy, as we saw in South Korea, as we saw in Taiwan, these economies ultimately move a repressive or authoritarian government into a more liberalized government. And the reason for that is because you have a free exchange of ideas. A market-based economy cannot survive unless you have technology, unless you have the free exchange of ideas between scientists and educators. And once that begins to occur, you will begin to see a liberalization process. I mean, think about it for a minute. If we didn't have CNN in China, in the southern part of China, what would it be like? Obviously, because you're seeing CNN in there, you're beginning to see at least provinces now demanding the right to vote, demanding at least some liberalization. And so in the long term, obviously, engaging the Chinese will have a positive benefit. But in conclusion, there is absolutely no question that for us to consider eliminating most favored nation status with the Chinese is in the exact opposite direction that we can possibly take. In fact, this debate, in my opinion, is harmful in the President's effort on an annual basis and the President's effort to try to normalize and stabilize relations with the Chinese, and so that we can begin to discuss with the Chinese some of the larger issues like human rights, like the issue of intellectual property, like the sale of nuclear weapons and chemicals. Those are the issues that have to be dealt with, but only if we stabilize this relationship.
Thanks, Bob. Next is Bob Manning, who is a senior fellow at the Progressive Policy Institute, which is the think tank arm of the Democratic Leadership Council and our resident expert on Asia. Bob.
Thank you very much, Senator. I don't find much to disagree with from what I've heard so far, but I want to try to put a different way to look at this whole problem in front of you. I guess my beginning of my argument is that we're having the wrong debate on China in the first place, that MFN is not foreign aid, it's not a favor, China is not my most favorite nation. It is simply the basis upon which international trade is conducted. There's a reason, and if you remove that, I think it will be the beginning of a downward spiral towards confrontation. with China, which I don't think either we nor China want or can afford. It's the last thread of normalcy, I would say, in our relationship. And why do we have this debate? Because we have a thing called the Jackson-Vanik Amendment, which served well in its time to try to focus on getting more Soviet immigration. And if you recall at the time, we had virtually no trade with the Soviet Union. Big difference. We have approximately $65 billion annually in two-way trade with China and roughly $12 billion in American foreign direct investment in China. It seems to me we've answered the question of whether we want to trade or invest in China. If we don't want to trade and invest with them, then we should take MFN away permanently, cut ourselves out of the China market, and move on. If we do think that it's in our interest, and I believe it is, then we ought to think about repealing Jackson-Vanik. And I would think the more important issue would be the World Trade Organization, which is going to define the terms of China's relationship with the international economic system for the generations to come. And I think we get diverted that there's very little attention. I'd rather see us debating this issue so we do that right, so we maintain a firm policy that forces commercially viable terms for China's entry, and we don't slip in our desire, in any kind of desire to just simply have them in, but to get them in on the right terms. That's a key point I think we need to debate. I think finally, we have to find a better way to think about China. The whole framework we usually talk about, engagement, containment, is the wrong way to think about China policy. Engagement is not a policy, it's a tactic. And containment is the wrong approach for a variety of reasons, which I spell out in the paper that you see out there. I think what we need to do is have a national debate that raises questions. What are our priorities? Where do we want to put our money down? What do we want from China? What do we need to have now? What can we wait on? Where is it going? How do we judge the trends in China, whether they're going in the right or wrong direction? I think I would call on the administration and the Congress to lead a vigorous national debate to try to work our way through these very difficult issues. And finally, I think a lot of the critics talk about China as if they're talking about a kind of Brezhnevian Soviet Union, a kind of monolithic, static entity. And I think the fact of the matter is that Deng Xiaoping made a bet in 1978 that the only way China could succeed is that he could ride the tiger of economic modernization and open up China. And that's Chinese highest goal, and that's the direction they're going. There's a famous one-liner that Deng said when they opened the markets that when we open things up, when you open up the windows, flies come in, and he said, well, we'll have to live with some flies. So I think those flies are the future. And I think over time, we've seen in every situation in Asia, in South Korea, in Taiwan, in Thailand, in the Philippines, that over time, when you have dynamic economic growth, decade after decade, what happens is you create an urban middle class, and over time, that urban middle class demands to be cut into the political system. I'm not going to tell you there's going to be a Democratic and Republican Party in China in 10 years, but I do think China is so much bigger. Political change in China will take a long time, and there's lots of permutations as to which way it can come out. But I think the broad trends, when you have a privatized economy that removes the state from people's lives, and that's what we've seen increasingly for millions of people in China over the last 18 years. So I think we have to, at bottom, have some confidence in our values, because I think they're prevailing all over the world. I don't think China is going to be an enormous exception, and then I'll stop there.
Thanks, Bob. It's very helpful. And finally, Al Fromm, who, as most of you know, was one of the originators, perhaps the originator of the New Democratic Movement in the mid-'80s, and continues to serve with great success and skill as the president of the Democratic Leadership Council.
We aren't going to have to wait until the year 2000 for the battle of for the soul of the Democratic Party to begin. It's already begun. In the fights this year on the budget and trade, the Democratic Party will decide whether it wants to lead our country into the 21st century or whether it wants to revert to the past. We're here today in support of the President's position on most favored nation status for China. As Senator Lieberman has said, expanding trade has been a defining issue for New Democrats. We believe expanding trade is vital to assuring upward mobility and opportunity for all our citizens. Expanding trade with fiscal discipline and investment in education and training are the cornerstones of President Clinton's spectacularly successful economic policies. That mixture of policies has produced the best economy for American workers in decades. It's resulted in the creation of more than 12 million new jobs, in an inflation rate under 3%, in rapid economic growth, in the lowest unemployment rate in a quarter century, in reestablishing American leadership in the world economy. And just today we learned that consumer confidence is the highest it's been in 28 years. Those policies and those outcomes lay the foundation for American prosperity as we enter the 21st century and the information age. It would be a mistake for our party to go back on those policies, to undermine that foundation. Heated rhetoric about fairness on the budget, about China, will not create opportunity